being here for session number 2. This is going to be on what remains of federal and state financing and incentives. My name is Chris Brown. I'm a board member of Solar Washington. In my day job, I'm a tax and business lawyer at Holland and Knight. And, this is an enormous topic. It's a bit of obviously it's a hot topic, very political at this point, but important. And so we've done our best to try to come up with some sort of subtopics within the bigger scheme of financing that will be interesting and hopefully helpful to the group. So let me have each of our panelists just introduce themselves and their organization, and then we'll come back for the content. Thanks. Go ahead, Eli.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eli Lieberman, and I'm the executive director of the newly formed Washington State Green Bank. I'll go into a little bit more detail during my presentation about the Green Bank.
Hello, I'm Jill Eichenhorst from Department of Commerce. I'm the renewables section manager. So I manage a portfolio of solar and other clean energy grant programs, including Clean Energy Fund and some other newer programs.
Hi, good morning. I'm AC Meyer. I'm the supervising attorney for tax and clean energy with Lawyers for Good Government, which is a nonprofit 501c3 entity that provides low bono and pro bono legal assistance, among other areas, to entities that are applying for federal tax credits for energy, especially through the elective pay process. And we'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation as well.
Okay, great. Why don't we get started? Let's see. I'm going to do just a few very brief comments at the outset on a few roadmap issues. The challenge of this was when we first started talking about the summit, it was fairly unclear, in fact, who was going to, win the election and the rest. And then as it went on, it's unclear what's going to happen to solar credits. And as it went further, it's sort of like, oh my God, this is going to be a depressing talk. So we've decided to soldier on nonetheless. And in fact, there are significant and important incentives out there and credits and benefits that can help all projects. To make this discussion manageable, I want to do a few kind of coverage points at the beginning. So one thing is when we think about the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm a tax lawyer, so I kind of study this stuff, but when we think about it, there's really two pieces. The tax piece is like a big triangle when we think about solar, with the top of the triangle being the homeowners, people who put solar on their roofs. Under the changes brought about by the Trump administration, the credits for all that is going to end at the end of this year. That means our installer friends in the group here are all working feverishly to get those projects done. There's probably no vacation for that group until January, is what I guess. The second piece on the lower left there is really what AC is going to talk about and really his focus. So this is, small business that wants solar, community solar, and what we call the direct pay crowd. And by direct pay, I mean those organizations that are eligible to get tax credits from the IRA, from the IRS, and this is like churches, nonprofits, cooperatives, tribes, and a few other groups like that. So that's really his focus. He's going to talk about those. For that group of people, it's about a 2-year runway to wind up the program for the Inflation Reduction Act benefits. And then finally, there's a utility scale, which we're not going to talk a lot about here, but just know the utility scale projects, hundreds of millions of dollars each. Those are ongoing. There's a few of those in Washington State right now. Those are all reliant on tax credits, the ones that are in process now. Very important. And the rules that AC is going to talk about will also apply to them with maybe even more stringency, I'd say. Okay. And the final thing I just mentioned, the other piece of the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, is the grant piece. And so this is just money that the government put into the administration to distribute for different projects. And it's helpful to think about the grant side of the IRA as two pieces. There's the Solar for All program, which was $7 billion that was awarded out to grant recipients in a competitive basis. Washington fortunately obtained a win on that and obtained a $156 million grant program from Solar for All funding from the EPA. That was recently canceled. There's ongoing litigation on that. In fact, there was a case filed about a week ago by the Attorney General of the state with about 20 other states here in Western Washington to challenge that cancellation. So that's ongoing. Then there's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That was the one, $20 billion. It's tied up with Citibank being involved as sort of the fund keeper, and lots of money that was earmarked to go out to all kinds of programs. But importantly for our discussion, a lot of that money was earmarked to go out as seed funding for lending institutions that were going to loan into solar projects. And Eli's going to talk about that aspect a bit under the kind of Green Bank program. Okay. The final thing I'll mention is that the baseline of the financing that's left, of course, is the state of Washington funding, and Jill will be covering that topic. So, okay, so why don't we get started? I'll turn it over to AC.
So I am very excited to be up here living my high school terrors as standing in front of a room of people and talking. 25 years, I still don't know what to do with my hands, but so generally have to get this. This is my don't punch our bar card slide. This is here for information, educational purposes. This is not direct legal advice for any specific project or any specific entity. We strive to have the most up-to-date materials available, but everything is constantly changing, especially under the current administration. So, use this as a jumping off point to consult with licensed attorneys in your area. So I want to talk a little bit about the changes that HR 1, everybody calls it the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, but if you actually look at the bill, that's not the name in it. It's still just HR 1. It shortens certain timelines for claiming the Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credit under Section 48E and the Production Tax Credit under Section 45Y. And these are really the credits that were accessible under elective pay for solar and wind energy property. Specifically, it shortened those timelines. For solar and wind, projects and property that begin construction on or before July 4th, 2026, remain subject to the pre-HR 1 eligibility timeline, which means you're not necessarily subject to that accelerated 2027 placement and service date that is otherwise required for solar and wind projects. If they begin construction after July 4th, 2026, they must be placed in service on or before December 31st, 2027 in order to remain eligible for these credits at the business and entity side. So other changes for ITC and production tax credit eligible technologies, not there. HR 1 did not make changes to timelines for anything other than solar and wind, at least in the elective pay ITC and PTC space. Obviously, things like electric vehicles and others have had some effects as well. But for things like energy storage, so battery energy systems, geothermal systems, hydroelectric, those retain the original credit timelines. Additionally, one thing I like to point out all the time is that energy storage is not just chemical batteries. Depending on the size of energy storage systems you're looking at, and when you're looking at utility scale, even things like gravity energy storage, I've seen entities be able to use basically a very heavy electric train that when there's excess electricity, it goes up a hill, and when there's need for extra electricity, it rolls down the hill to generate electricity from gravity. And that is considered a battery or energy storage under the system. Similar with pumped hydro systems, that might be possible in Washington. So I know this is focused on solar, but those are other areas to keep in mind and know that battery is not necessarily chemical battery, especially as that comes into play with restrictions around prohibited foreign entities and prohibited materials, and the fact that a large number of battery chemicals are only mined in China. Timeline for non-solar, non-wind, again, not changed. Must begin construction by the end of 2033 to claim the full amount of credit, and there is a reduced phase out in 2034 and 2035. Talk a little bit about what it means to begin construction, because it feels like it should be one of those things that's very obvious. And of course, because this is tax, we have tax court cases going back to the 1960s where people have been arguing about what is obviously beginning of construction and what is not. Um, so right now, the two primary notices, and if you look at the slides later on, these are linked, and if you really need reading to put you to sleep at the end of the night, you can look at these notices. But these provide the primary methods that you're used to establish beginning of construction. And this is for lawyer thoroughness, just confirmation that those notices, even though they're older, still apply to the new sections. The two primary methods are either the physical work test or the 5% safe harbor. Under physical work test, that basically means that physical work of a significant nature will establish the beginning of construction. The 5% cost safe harbor is the date on which at least 5% of the cost of eligible property is paid or incurred by the entity that owns and places the property into service. Now that includes overruns. So one of the biggest hurdles with the 5% test is we'll have entities, I've seen entities pay 5% of the estimates, have the project go 50% over budget, and all of a sudden that 5% is not 5% of the total cost anymore. It's 5% of that initial estimate. And that has pushed their beginning of construction date into the next year in some circumstances. So in practice, what we see most entities doing is adding some sort of buffer there. There's also ongoing requirements. Essentially, once you begin construction, you have to maintain a continuous program of construction, have continuous progress towards completion in order to preserve that start date. But there is the good news there is if essentially if a project is placed in service within 4 years of the date that it begins construction, that's presumed to have been continuous and there's no record keeping necessary there. So that greatly simplifies for things like rooftop solar and smaller non-utility scale projects that are almost certainly going to be placed in service within 4 years of the beginning of construction. The continuity test, again, what can establish continuity? Paying or incurring certain amounts that are included in total costs, entering binding written contracts for additional components, obtaining permits, performing additional work of significant nature. So, physically having people out in the field installing panels, installing piers for placement of panels, et cetera. And delays that are outside the owner's control generally don't cause problems with that continuity requirement. So if there's severe weather, if there's natural disaster, if the government stops issuing permits, as long as you're documenting those permits that you're trying, those permitting delays do not thwart this continuity of construction. Also, delays due to supply shortages or financing issues. We saw a lot of that during COVID, and there were automatic extensions of that continuity safe harbor resulting from that. But even on a smaller scale, as long as you can document that you're having these shortages, that will not necessarily disrupt continuity of construction. There are some specific wrinkles for solar because it's a target right now, frankly. Under guidance for solar and wind and the phase out dates, only for purpose of determining whether that accelerated 2027 placement and service date applies, there are some restrictions on which methods can be used. Again, this is only for the very narrow purpose of determining whether that 2027 phase out applies. Essentially, solar property that is over 1.5 megawatts and all wind property is restricted to only using the physical work test to establish beginning of construction. If you have a solar project that's larger than 1.5 megawatts, if you have a wind project, you cannot use the 5% safe harbor to establish beginning of construction to determine whether or not that 2027 placement and service deadline applies. For solar projects, solar property under 1.5 megawatt, you can continue to use either method as desired, as fits your specific use best. So the good news is that most rooftop solar systems are not going to be anywhere near this 1.5 megawatt limit, and most of those are still going to be able to get in and not have to worry about this additional restriction. But it is something to worry about, especially for utility scale and potentially community solar projects, when you start looking at things that will serve about 450 households or more, I think is right around where 1.5 megawatts hits if Google remains accurate. Other beginning of construction dates, and these are dates for anything other than wind and solar, and also for any purposes other than determining whether that 2027 placement and service date applies. If you begin construction on or before December 31st, property that begins construction prior to that date is not subject to the new material assistance restrictions, which deals with where the company that produces components is headquartered or organized. And unlike the domestic content requirements, which look at where items are produced, this looks to where the company that produces the product is headquartered. So a Chinese company that operates a solar fab in the US, panels produced at that fab might be domestic content for purposes of the domestic content requirements. They are considered to be products of prohibited foreign entities under these foreign entity guidelines because the company that owns that fab is headquartered in China. So that becomes an issue, and it requires a little bit more digging into where the companies are from. And unfortunately, that really doesn't seem to care much whether it's domestic products or domestic labor producing these. But if you get the project into construction before the date at the end of this year, that does mean it's not subject to that requirement, and it simplifies the documentation or materials to that more familiar domestic content requirement. There may still be some other prohibited foreign entity restrictions that apply relating to payments made to foreign entities, as well as ownership by foreign entities, depending on when tax years start and end for all y'all. And again, between January 1st and July 4th of 2026, if construction begins there, those projects must comply with the material assistance provisions and may be subject, again, depending on when tax years begin and end, to the other prohibited foreign entity restrictions. Anything that begins construction after July 4th, 2026 has to comply with all of the prohibited foreign entity rules. And that creates a bit of a hurdle in terms of documentation. And with that, I'll turn things over to Eli.
Could I, just a quick question. So AC, could you maybe describe a bit, Lawyers for Good Government is kind of a nationwide organization. You're here in Washington State. I'm just curious, in Washington State, could you give us a sense of how many projects you are touching or have touched, or what sort of the typical project in this state here?
Oh, wow. See, I don't have the numbers here in front of me. So we've done, I think, through the SETCAP program. So we're working with the state of Washington, funded by Department of Commerce for the Clean Energy Tax Credit Assistance Program here. And that provides free legal assistance with these projects for claiming these federal tax credits, as well as free filing assistance. So that's the big thing, is we work with a preparer who is also funded by Department of Commerce, who will take care of the tax filing and make sure that the forms get filed correctly. But in terms of total number of entities that we've worked with, between the office hours that we've held and direct assistance, at this point, it's into triple digits if we're counting everybody who's been to office hours and has come in and received aid that way. And we're in moderate double digits in terms of entities that we have worked with directly in terms of specific projects who have given us a retention letter, which is just basically, that just establishes that you're protected by our malpractice insurance, which we haven't needed, but lawyers, we cover our backsides all the time. But when we get into that, where we're giving specific advice, we're still in the moderate double digits there. I think somewhere between 40 and 50 entities we've provided direct assistance, even in Washington.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I guess, I mean, what's interesting for me as a lawyer, when the credits first came out, and when I read through them, how they worked, I mean, just the thought of, say, a state and local government agency that wants to put solar panels on the gymnasium at the high school roof or something. The way this is going to work is they have to file they have to register the IRS, file a tax return with the IRS, get basically a refund check from the IRS, somehow finance that gap before they get the refund check. There's all these moving parts, and it's almost inconceivable to think you couldn't do this, that you could do this somehow without a lawyer. Because it is complex. And I just wonder, AC, as you see it, I mean, are these projects doable with elective pay without, say, a really good accountant and a sharp lawyer who actually knows the rules? Can people kind of, through IRS instructions and internet, get through it? Or do they really need legal guidance to get a project done?
We've seen entities be successful with smaller projects with this, but we've also seen entities, frankly, faceplant trying to do it on their own. In one case, worked with a CPA who swore up and down that they knew what they were doing and had filed these forms before and filed the wrong forms, ended up past the deadline, lost the credit entirely because of that. So working with entities that have been through this before, even if it's just to come to an office hours and get very general guidance for smaller projects, definitely helpful, and definitely encourage anyone who's interested to look at the SETCAP program within Washington, because that does provide all of that assistance for free, funded by the Department of Commerce. And you've been a wonderful partner on that, by the way.
Right. Okay. Okay. Why don't we wrap up? So I would just say, emphasize to the crowd, as a lawyer, lots of lawyers are very smart. They know the law, they know the area, but what's truly valuable is someone who has multiple touches on a project that's kind of like yours. So multiple points in the past, they've done something similar, because that person has seen the projects that have gone bad, has seen the problems, have seen the things. And I think that's what Lawyers for Good Government can offer up here. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, AC. Yeah, the Green Bank community is forever grateful to Lawyers for Good Government. They've been helping out this organization called the U.S. Green Bank 50 quite a bit. So the work they do is incredible. So hi, everyone. I'm Eli Lieberman, the Executive Director of the newly formed Washington State Green Bank. Prior to being at the Washington State Green Bank, I was the Chief Investment Officer at Michigan Saves, which is one of the original green banks created in the country. I was working remotely from Seattle. And then prior to that, I worked for the Washington State government in a couple different capacities. So I'm really excited to be here and really excited that this organization has gotten going. So one thing I like to just set the stage with when I talk about the Washington State Green Bank is what we do. And that is, we work in this world of project finance. And for a lot of rooms that I speak to, I think this is kind of a newer topic. I'd imagine that this is just classic for many of you in this room. But really, with solar, as you all know, the contractors need to be paid upfront when they're installing the panels, and the benefits of reduced bills accrue over time. So what project finance does is, instead of like getting a mortgage where the asset, your house, is sort of the core component of the underwriting on whether or not you'll be able to secure debt to purchase it, project finance actually looks at the cash flows from the project. So over time, as electricity prices change, how much will you be saving or generating? And then is that enough to cover the cost of debt? You're looking for cash flows to be greater than debt service is what we talk about. So some big components of that are something called the capital stack. And that can be made up of a bunch of different things. Equity, like tax credit equity, like AC was talking about, grants, like what the Department of Commerce so generously offers, rebates from, say, a utility, and then finally debt. And all of those things can be mingled together to help create these stacks that allow a project to get built. When it comes to debt, the term length and the interest rate are the two biggest levers that we can work with to help make it so that cash flow exceeds debt service. So what is a green bank? Well, if you thought it was a bank, you'd be wrong. I don't know why you would think that, but green banks are not depository institutions, so they don't take in customer deposits and then use that as the capital that they lend out. Instead, what they really are is they're either fully public, quasi-public, or independent 501c3s like Washington State's Green Bank. And what they do is they are confined to the geographic region in which they receive their public sector dollars. So they're all supported by their respective units of government. So in the case of the DC Green Bank, they receive annual appropriations from the city of DC. In the case of Montgomery County Green Bank, they receive annual appropriations from Montgomery County, New York Green Bank, state of New York. And they look at that given geographic region and they go, what are the gaps in project finance? Where are markets not being animated? Who is not able to install these clean energy systems or energy efficiency technologies? And then what they'll do is they take those public sector resources and they look to crowd in private sector capital to fill those gaps. So it's really about getting leverage on public sector resources and not by any means crowding out the private sector market, but trying to bring them in to fill these these gaps to animate these markets. And to date, they've been incredibly successful. The Connecticut Green Bank has a 7-to-1 leverage ratio. So they've received about $400-ish million from the state of Connecticut, and they've turned that into $3 billion. The New York Green Bank has been capitalized of about $1 billion, and they've created about $11 billion worth of clean energy projects in the state of New York. So they're just incredibly efficient uses of public sector resources. So how do they work, you might ask? Well, they have about 3 different modes that they work with. One is called credit enhancements. So this is where we're in a scenario, say in residential energy efficiency. I came from Michigan Saves. They're the masters at this, where we want to ensure that in emergency situations where your heater in Spokane goes out in the middle of the night, or say you're actually planning an energy efficiency upgrade, or you want to install solar, that there is a low-cost financing option for you, because not a lot of people have $10,000, $15,000 in cash sitting around. So what Michigan Saves does is it takes its state appropriations and it uses that as a loan loss reserve, otherwise known as a credit enhancement, with their credit union partners. And this allows the credit unions to offer longer term lengths and charge what's called in the industry the prime rate. So that's the rate at which a bank or a credit union would charge Bill Gates to borrow money, like the best borrower. With a credit enhancement, you can get the prime rate to go to a much wider swath of borrowers, which is a really powerful tool a green bank can do. Sometimes, more so, say in the commercial space, credit enhancements can't move the needle as much. So what a green bank would do is lend directly off its balance sheet. And again, it's looking to crowd in private sector capital. So maybe what it would do is a subordinated first loss position. So this would be, say, for a big solar project or for commercial energy efficiency. The developer might have trouble attracting capital. So the green bank would go to a bigger lender and go, well, what if we took 25% of the project cost, we lent at 2% interest, so that'll blend the overall interest rate down. And what if, in the case of a default, we were the ones that would take that first loss? And then the lender's going to go, oh, that sounds like a pretty good deal for me. And then they're going to be much more inclined to fill in that other 75% of the project cost. So that's another way of just crowding in. Another example for what AC was talking about with, say, direct pay, it's an incredible asset for nonprofits and municipalities to monetize the solar investment tax credit. But again, say you installed a solar project on January 1st, your tax year is, the calendar year. So all of a sudden now, you're going to file your taxes the following year. The IRS is going to take some time to process that. There's a huge lag from when you need to pay the contractor to when you're going to receive direct pay. A green bank would say, let me just bridge that for you. So I'll pay the contractor now, and then I'll take assignment of the tax credit when you receive it. And then finally, I think this is a really underappreciated aspect of green banks, but we know that soft costs are a huge factor in what's, I think it's like 65% of the cost of residential solar in the United States is soft costs. So that's not the physical, that's not the panels, right? So a green bank could play a huge role in helping bring those soft costs down, which is going to make solar more accessible. And I think it's going to be crucial in this new market where we don't have the tax credits. So what do green banks fund? Well, we're here to talk about solar, but they'll do a lot more than that. They'll do solar, renewable energy, geothermal, they'll do battery storage, they'll do zero emissions fleet work, they'll do the infrastructure that goes along with it, they'll do geothermal heating, they'll do decarbonization, really everything you can think of. I just pulled a couple examples here of what green banks are up to in the residential solar space. So Maryland recently launched this residential solar product that's really trying to bring low interest long-term debt to allow homes, that are in the low to moderate income space in order to install solar, because a lot of residential solar transactions are cash transactions. And if you're an LMI customer, you just don't have that. So this is not the most scalable model, but they do run a linked deposits program. So that allows them to bring that interest rate down, and it's not depleting any of the underlying principal. So they can just keep this running. I don't know if we call community solar residential or commercial, but the New York Green Bank effectively has, this is just one example. They have built the market for community solar in the state of New York. So they've poured hundreds of millions of dollars. This is just one loan. So this is like a blip on their radar of projects that they do, but it's $100 million, so it's huge. And this particular one was for 79 megawatts of community solar. So again, that's revolving back to them. They'll be able to re-lend it out. And then I think, at a price per watt, like $1 per watt, that's really good use of public sector dollars. So commercial solar, again, green banks are super active. And I think it's always important to remember that they're getting leverage on their investments. So when the Connecticut Green Bank says they're going to do $110 million worth of solar, that really means that it's going to be $770 million worth of impact. And then I just pulled another example of how even a city Green Bank is making a huge impact. The DC Green Bank does a lot with solar, and they've done massive commercial installations on universities like Howard University in DC. So the Washington State Green Bank, as I was saying, is a 501c3 green bank, which is kind of the flavor du jour, I would say, right now of green banks. The Colorado Green Bank, Nevada, Washington, even New Mexico just formed one. They're all sort of forming as 501c3s. And I think that might be because it gives them the ability to react to the market maybe a touch quicker than if it was housed within a government agency. With Washington, we also have that, lending of the state's credit issue. So by having it be a 501c3, it doesn't fall into that problem. So we were formed with help, again, so many accolades to our friends at the Department of Commerce, thanks to the Washington State Department of Commerce and the city of Seattle. If it wasn't for those two organizations, we would not exist. So eternally grateful to them. And then our initial funding came from the Climate Commitment Act. And one of the reasons we got going was that Commerce and the city of Seattle did a market scan of the state, and they determined that we had some barriers that were classic barriers that green banks could overcome. So we have a fragmented financing landscape. So we kind of don't have a lot of financing players, and they also work in certain geographic restrictions. So we don't really have great statewide solutions. Of those couple players that we have, they're very capital constrained, so they don't have a ton of funding available. And we're talking about billions of dollars of need. There's a lot of uncertainty for contractors because of this fragmented, nature, that you cross these arbitrary lines in the state from one utility to another utility, from one county to another county, and there's all these different programs and processes, et cetera. Scale, there's so many properties that need work. All this stuff is kind of classic, and there are issues that green banks have been proven to solve in other states across the country. So green bank capitalization, as I was saying, we were fortunate to receive $800,000 in Climate Commitment Act funds, with the idea that our real capitalization would come from what Chris talked about earlier, which was the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which was was actually $27 billion. $7 billion was Solar for All. The other $20 billion was for quote unquote green banking activities. And that's where we really hoping we were going to receive our large capitalization. But that now has put us in a tricky spot, with that funding basically being inaccessible during this administration, if not ever. So when we look to how much capitalization we've received compared to three of the most recent green banks, it's a bit low. So Minnesota also just formed a green bank at the exact same time as us, and they were seeded with $45 million in general appropriations. So like the equivalent of the general fund in Washington. Colorado Clean Energy Fund, $35 million, and the Connecticut Green Bank receives about $30 million annually. So we're in a bit of a tough spot right now. We would be really the only green bank that didn't receive meaningful state support for our activities. So we're really hoping that in the future, we'll be able to access more Climate Commitment Act funds. So how are green banks traditionally funded? Well, mostly it is government appropriations, but they do work with philanthropy and private capital. And usually they'll source their funding to match their needs. So if it is going to be really like looking to do more de-risking of private sector capital, working in a more, underinvested area, they're going to use mostly government appropriations or possibly PRIs from philanthropy because you can be more risk tolerant with that money. Green banks will run market rate programs, and sometimes when it comes to a market rate program, you can borrow market rate money. So that means they might be able to lever their balance sheets, so what they've received from their governments, to take out, say, lines of credit from a bank and then re-lend that money. So they'll match those sources of uses. And that is all I have. So thank you all so much and really appreciate being here.
Eli, let me, no, who's that? Let me just ask a question, really helpful presentation. So could you walk us through in a typical project, say community solar, right? Is the green bank backed lending, is that the loan kind of at the very front end, like startup costs, or is it the construction cost, or is it the loan that sort of refinances the construction loan?
Yeah, great question, Chris. The answer is it could be all of them. So I think it would, community solar is so interesting because like the definition of what community solar is and then the regulatory environments. I think that's one where each market creates really unique needs. So like in the case of, WSU's community solar expansion program, that could be, bridge lending there. But in the case of like NYSERDA in New York, like they're providing construction and permanent debt to a third-party developer. So it really would just depend on the nature of the market.
I see. And also your counterparties in this state, when you think about if you're going out to lenders, we're talking about sort of credit unions,
Yeah,
as
exactly.
well as private banks, including the biggest banks, right, who have sort of some community development obligations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think when we think more about the residential space and say residential solar or small commercial, that's really working with local credit unions, local small CDFIs, and helping them bring more capital into that space. When you're thinking more about, say, the Clean Buildings Performance Standard, which is this massive decarbonization that we're going to need to do to buildings over 50,000 square feet in Washington, there we're talking about just like seemingly like tens of billions of dollars. So that's where a green bank is going to want to work with, Chase and Bank of Montreal and large players.
I see. So you have to have a suit and tie as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay, super. Thanks. Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. And now turning it over to Jill.
All right, hello everyone. The good news is we do have funding at the state level, so be able to talk about that. So first of all, it's great when almost every presenter I think has mentioned your organization, Department of Commerce. We are actually a huge organization. We've grown a lot lately. We have programs throughout different sectors of Washington economy and supporting communities, and our mission is to strengthen communities. The energy division within Commerce is our state energy office. And our vision is that the people of Washington thrive in a clean, affordable, and equitable energy economy. I'm here to talk about solar funding opportunities, but we actually have so many different energy funding opportunities. And I know some of you work in different areas of energy as well. So clean transportation supports electrifying our transportation system. Our clean buildings and home energy rebates programs are working on decarbonizing our building sector. Weatherization program is supporting low-income residents and helping reduce bills and increase comfort in their homes. The Energy Programs and Communities unit is where I work. And in addition to solar, we have funding for grid resilience and reliability work and RD&D funding for future, next-gen clean energy technologies. And finally, we have technical assistance opportunities. You've already heard about one of those, a Clean Energy Tax Credit Assistance Program, and many others as well. And so these provide assistance instead of funding or in addition to funding to help projects do some of the planning work that they need to deploy projects. And so our 2025 solar programs, if you're familiar with the state funding process, budget process, it's the 25-27 funding biennium. And so the state budgets in 2-year increments. And so that started on July 1st of this year and goes through June 30th, 2027. We did have a state budget shortfall in this biennium. And so there was definitely a reduction in funding for solar and clean energy grant programs from previous bienniums. But I think overall, it's a lot better than it could have been. There's still a good amount of funding there. And, much better, much more, in fact, than only 4 or 5 years ago when I first started at Commerce. So there's still a lot of support coming from the state. And also, I don't have it in my slides here, but the state does also have the WSU Community Solar Expansion Program. I think we're going to hear more from WSU later today. But that's another large opportunity that's funding solar within the state. So we have 4 funding opportunities I want to highlight for solar available right now. So Clean Energy Grants Program is kind of our flagship opportunity this year. It has $32 million for a broad range of clean energy projects and applicant types. It's actually taking 3 different funding sources and making them available through one process. And that is currently open and due November 4th, so in a little more than a week. And then the Tribal Clean Energy Grants Program is making $9 million available for tribe-led clean energy projects, also due November 4th. And I have more information about each of these on the next slides. I also want to highlight the Clean Energy Siting and Permitting Program. This is now closed. We're evaluating applications right now, but it's just important to know that we are supporting siting and permitting throughout the state. This is for tribes and local governments in particular. And, I know siting issues are becoming more and more common now. And so we really want to support a proactive approach to permitting projects throughout the state to reduce conflict. And also coming soon, we have had a RD&D program, research, development, and demonstration. So we are planning a request for information to assess interest in funding for innovative technologies. So this could be, more innovative solar technologies, kind of next generation products. And some more detail on the Clean Energy Grants Program. So as I mentioned, $32 million. This is available basically for everyone, state, tribes, local governments, for-profits, nonprofits can apply. Eligible projects include solar, storage, and storage projects, and also other renewable technology, and it can fund planning or construction phases. One thing that's new and different this year is that we are funding feasibility studies only through our technical assistance opportunity. This means that we will select a contractor or multiple contractors who will work directly with Commerce, and that RFP is also open right now if you're interested in learning more about that. We'll select a contractor who will then work with communities who have applied through this opportunity to get technical assistance. So this is building on a model that we used previously in our Solar Plus Storage for Resilient Communities program. And I will talk more about it, but just important note that because we have limited funding, we are not funding feasibility study only projects through cash grants, basically, through this opportunity. And so some additional details. The match requirement is for profits is 50% of total project costs. All others have no match required across all projects, all entity types, other than for-profit organizations. And the award amounts, planning can be $50,000 to $100,000. Construction can be $75,000 to $2.5 million. And importantly, we are really prioritizing construction-ready projects. This is a huge focus right now for commerce in the state. And so we have limited funding for planning projects, but there is some funding available for that. And within the construction category, we're also looking for projects that can move forward quickly. So if they have, basically ready to begin construction as soon as we make awards, as much as possible, having permits in place and things like that will be prioritized. Doesn't mean that if you don't have all those steps completed, you're not eligible though, just that we're prioritizing projects that are more ready to move forward with construction. And then the Tribal Clean Energy Grants Program, we have $9 million. So this is available for tribes and tribes contracted service providers. The eligible projects include solar and storage again, and other renewable technologies, and again, planning or construction phases. Through this opportunity, technical assistance for feasibility studies is also available. And we are supporting tribes with grants if they want to go out and select their own provider for those feasibility studies as well. We just want to make sure tribes are able to make those, build on the relationships they already have with contractors, make those decisions themselves. No match is required. And the one difference here for tribes is that the planning grants go a little higher, up to $200,000 as well. And so technical assistance, we had a little preview of this already. So with the solar and storage feasibility studies, folks will be able to apply through the clean energy grants or tribal clean energy grants opportunity. It's a relatively simple application. We tried to take out a lot of the technical information and really just talking about, your organization, what you're doing, what the benefits of the project are that you're hoping to construct, and then be able to apply for this no-cost feasibility study. We will then match the recipients that we select through that grant program with a feasibility study consultant. And so then there's no contract between the technical assistance recipient and the consultant, which, and they don't have to go through an RFP process to select. And so we found with our previous model that this really helped reduce costs and simplified the process for everyone involved. So we really wanted to emphasize that in this biennium where we have just less funding available. And an exciting new twist here is that the funding, once these projects get their feasibility studies, Commerce will look at them to determine if they are cost effective and feasible. And then we will recommend them for funding to the legislature in the next biennium without an additional application. So they don't have to apply again for construction. We know that application process takes a lot of time and energy. And so we just want to evaluate those projects once and then make those recommendations. We can't guarantee they'll get funding, but this way we can at least try to get funding for each of those projects that we've already evaluated. And finally, we've heard about the Clean Energy Tax Credit Assistance Program already, but I really encourage you to check out this program if you or your customers need assistance with these tax credit deadlines and requirements, filing, and there's also connection to technical resources. We're really emphasizing this opportunity. We were so grateful we had it in place prior to the recent changes to the bill that we could make it available to help navigate all of these new rules that are, pretty complex. And partnering with Lawyers for Good Government on that, of course. You can hear more about our programs, our funding opportunities on our website. That QR code will take you to the Energy Programs in Communities unit website or webpage, and you can email us as well. I can't answer questions about the RFAs today about the open funding opportunities. Those need to go through a formal process, and Q&A closes today. So maybe use some lunchtime to get your questions in if you have those. And I also want to put a plug in because we still need evaluators for our grant program. So if anyone's interested in evaluating, Eli was just reminding me that he did it for us a few years in a row. And it's interesting opportunity to see what kind of grant applications come in. It's hard for us to find people who don't have a conflict of interest because you can't be party to one of those grant applications or getting business from it later. But if you're not in that one of those categories, I'd love to talk to you. So please come and talk to me about it.
Super. Can I just ask a question? So
Absolutely.
on the grant applications and the grant program, are the folks applying, I mean, they're applying for the state grant, but I assume they're also getting, or also counting on kind of the federal credit as well. So that doesn't preclude them from applying.
So the federal tax credit is not required. You know, you saw that there's no match requirement. So for-profits do have a match requirement. So they may be interested in getting tax credits to help cover some of that match. And so then otherwise it's really up to the applicant if they are wanting to take that tax credit or, you know, potentially if they're on the high end, you know, they're doing a really large project and want to take the tax credit, then they might need additional funding beyond our award maximum. And, you know, we have in the past kind of required projects to at least provide 30% match to encourage them to leverage the tax credit. But we just found that like the financing options weren't in place and the technical resources weren't in place to help those projects get over the finish line. And we really saw a lot of projects, you know, we heard feedback that people didn't even apply because of it. And we even saw projects that had to cancel because they couldn't secure those tax credits for whatever reason. And so I think really important to have the whole ecosystem, and we were building that. And so it's not required at all to use the tax credit as part of the state funding match.
Right. Okay, great. Yeah, and I think that points out that these projects, you know, as the project complexity gets bigger, that also makes kind of the grant application process trickier too, right? Because you've got built a bigger capital stack and the rest with different contingencies. But you know, as Jill mentioned, for these grant programs, you don't really need any of that. If you just want to get a grant in your nonprofit to pay for the entire project, that's possible now. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, super. So why don't you have a seat? And then I think we have 5 minutes or so if there's questions from the audience. Oh my God, hands going up. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Did I hear you correctly that battery storage is not affected by this HR 1 bill? So that's for residential, et cetera? 30% tax credit remains?
Under the credits available to entities, so I can't really speak to the individual tax credits that we might claim on, say, a 1040. But for credits that are claimed by eligible entities through elective pay, battery energy storage is not, there's no shorter timeline for that under HR 1. It will still have to meet the prohibited foreign entity requirements, which does create some issues for batteries given that entities related to China are particularly scrutinized right now, and significant portions of battery chemicals are mined either mostly or exclusively in China, and that does create some issues for chemical batteries. But the credits remain in place for that into the 2030s potentially.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, sir. Okay.
Battery, are they eligible for tax credits for the component that they get from Commerce?
So the credits are based on the cost of the components. So if the component is essentially fully funded by a grant specifically for that component, the tax credit would be reduced to zero.
Okay.
But if Washington State has a credit that pays for 80% of the cost, normally the tax credits are in the 30% range.
Right. So, but if Commerce is paying for the entire thing, then
Yeah.
there's no tax credit.
If they're paying for the entire thing, there's none. If they're paying for like 80%, the credit would just be reduced to 20% of the cost. So the credits can still be useful to kind of top you up to that 100% value if you don't have a full grant.
Okay, over here, go ahead, sir. Right here, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Hondo from the Swinomish tribe. For Jill, just double checking on the grants coming up in November for tribal clean energy. If we submit multiple applications and I'm told we're able to do that, and we some of those grants, if we just submit through the tribal, that the Commerce will on the back end move them to the other programs.
Yes, thank you. I did mean to mention that. So the tribal opportunity is tailored to tribes, and so we want to make sure that that we had a specific opportunity for tribes and exclusive access to that funding. But we will also consider those applications for the other funding as well. So you do not have to apply twice. That's the whole goal here, is that we don't want projects to have to apply to multiple different funding opportunities.
Okay, why don't we go one more, and then after this question, you're certainly free to grab any of us during the breaks and stuff and talk. And then also I'll just mention, we're going to do a webinar on the same topic with speakers from these same organizations, very likely first week of December. So keep looking at the website for that. But go ahead, the gentleman with the microphone.
Hi, AC. Quick question. How generic can that 5% safe harbor be? Could I buy, a bunch of panels for unnamed projects, or do I need to know who they are?
There's active debate on that specific question regarding kind of stockpiling. The general consensus is the less of a solid project idea there is, the riskier that is. You don't necessarily have to say this panel is going on this specific building on this date at this time kind of thing. But if there are no contemplated projects at all, that then becomes a lot more difficult to justify. Obviously, most things live between those extremes, and unfortunately, that's still a bit mitigated or a bit unclear, and there hasn't been guidance around that. I will say kind of the prevailing discussion that I'm hearing right now has been, for example, if you have an entity that is routinely has a pipeline of projects coming in, so you might say, we don't know for sure which roof this panel is going on, but we know that we have roofs in the pipeline. That more attorneys that I'm talking with are feeling that that's a little bit more comfort level than we're just going to buy a bunch of panels and hope that someday we have a project for them. So I think, somewhere in that line, I wish I had better information for you or clearer guidance. But I'm going to fall on the attorney classic of that depends.
Okay, I think our time is up. We have to get the next panel up here, but thanks everyone for showing up to this, and we'll be around to answer questions.